I'm Major Anna George, 34 years old, a U.S. Army Ranger. Last week, I stood in my parents' living room in Fayetteville, North Carolina, wearing my full Army service uniform for the first time on a visit home. My chest was covered in medals. I was there to tell them about my promotion. But my father didn't look at the medals. He looked at me with that familiar, soul-crushing smirk and said, "You think those cheap pieces of tin make you better than me? You're still worthless." And when I didn't back down, his hand came up. The bruise on my cheek isn't from the Taliban, it's from my own father. My mother just watched, and then she turned away. They thought that slap was the end of it. They thought they had put me back in my place. But they didn't know that, in that exact moment, I had a camera on my lapel, and it was rolling. Let me know where you're watching from, hit that like button, and subscribe. This story is for anyone who has ever been made to feel like the enemy by their own family, just because you chose to survive. The air in the Cumberland County Courthouse was thick and still, tasting of old paper and stale coffee. It was a controlled quiet, the kind where every sound is magnified. The only sound as I walked down the center aisle was the sharp, rhythmic click-clack of my military-issue dress shoes on the polished linoleum floor. Each step was a measured beat, a declaration. I was on a mission. My Army service uniform, the deep blue jacket and lighter blue trousers, was perfectly pressed. The brass on my belt buckle gleamed under the flat fluorescent lights. I had to take special leave from my post to be here, to fight this battle on home soil. Beneath a thin layer of concealer, the ugly purple-yellow bruise on my cheekbone throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. It was a gift from my father, from last week. As I entered, a ripple of whispers moved through the pews, then died out. The room fell silent. Today, I was not here as a damaged daughter. I was here as an officer, and I was the defendant, in a lawsuit filed by my own parents. They wanted the court to take away the one piece of this world that was truly mine, my grandfather's land. They were sitting in the front row, a united front of betrayal. My father, a big man whose presence sucked the air out of a room, a pillar of the First Baptist Church, turned his head. His eyes met mine, and that smirk spread across his face. It wasn't a smile, it was a weapon. The one he'd used to grind me down since I was a child. It was the same smirk he had when he'd locked the pantry full of snacks, reminding me that I hadn't earned the right to eat them. It was the same smirk he wore when he told me West Point was a place for weaklings who couldn't handle the real world. It was a smirk that said, "I own you. I can break you whenever I want." Beside him, my mother was the picture of Southern grace in her Sunday dress, a string of pearls resting on her collarbone. She glanced at the bruise on my face, and her lips tightened, not with pity, but with sheer annoyance. I could read her thoughts as clearly as a field manual. She was mortified that I had brought this army business, this ugliness, into the public eye. That I had embarrassed her. She turned her gaze away, her hand fluttering up to adjust her perfect pearls as if I were just a scuff mark on her pristine wall. I walked past them without a word and took my place at the defendant's table. It was a table designed for two, a client and their counsel. I sat there alone. I had called 5 different lawyers in Fayetteville. The first one had laughed. "Sue your own parents in this county? Good luck with that, little lady." The fourth one had said, "I know your father. He's a good man. Maybe you should just go home and talk things out." The last one simply hung up when I said my father's name. This was his territory. His power was in the whispers in the church pews, the handshakes at the Rotary Club, the deep-rooted favors he'd cultivated for decades. He expected me to crumble under the weight of that influence. He was waiting for the tears, for me to lose my composure, to prove him right. That's how he always won. But Ranger School teaches you to metabolize pain, to turn it into fuel. The piece of IED shrapnel still lodged near my right kneecap sent a sharp, familiar signal up my leg, a reminder of a different war. I didn't flinch. I just breathed. Pain is temporary, the mantra echoed in my mind. So is fear. I pulled my chair in, planted both feet firmly on the floor, and kept my spine perfectly straight. My silence was my shield. When the bailiff called the room to order and the judge entered, I rose to my feet, faced him, and met his gaze directly. It was the silent, universal language of military respect. My father leaned over to his lawyer, his voice a stage whisper designed to carry across the room. "She's unstable," he said, shaking his head with faux concern. "The war? It damaged her." The judge, an older man with tired but perceptive eyes, settled into his high-backed chair and banged the gavel once. The sound echoed with finality. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the paperwork. Then his gaze lifted and swept across me. His eyes moved over the decorations on my chest, a roadmap of my service. He paused for a fraction of a second, his gaze stopping on the silver cross hanging just below the ribbons. The Distinguished Service Cross. He cleared his throat. The room held its breath. "We are here to hear Petition 72B, he began, his voice raspy with authority. "The case of George versus—" He paused, looked directly at me again, and his tone shifted. It was no longer the voice of a bureaucrat reading a docket. It was the voice of a man showing respect. "Major George." Just those two words. They landed in the silent room like a grenade, obliterating the narrative my father had so carefully constructed. The whispering stopped. My father's body went rigid, the smirk wiped clean from his face. My mother's perfectly manicured hand froze on its way to her pearls. For 34 years, he had defined me. He had called me useless, a disappointment, a disgrace. But in this room, under the seal of the state of North Carolina, I was not their failure. I was not their broken little girl. I was Major George. And that's when I knew. The power had just shifted. That look on my father's face, that stunned, furious disbelief when his power was challenged. I'd seen it before. It was the same look he gave me when I was a child, the day I learned that survival meant fighting back. It took me right back to the beginning. My childhood in North Carolina wasn't a war zone of shouting matches and slamming doors. It was a Cold War, fought in the chilling silence between words, in the spaces where affection was supposed to be. My father was a master tactician of quiet cruelty. His power wasn't in his fists, not usually. It was in the small, relentless rules that defined my existence. The most potent symbol of my place in the family was a small brass key. To be more specific, it was the lock on the pantry door. Inside that pantry was everything a kid could want. Bags of potato chips, Oreo cookies, boxes of sugary cereal, cans of soda. And that pantry was always locked. My older brother Daniel, the golden child, had a key. I did not. Food was not a right in our house. It was a privilege, a reward, and I was rarely deemed worthy. I remember one afternoon, I was maybe 14, I came home bursting with pride. I had gotten an A+ on my advanced algebra final. I walked into the kitchen, the report card clutched in my hand like a trophy, ready to finally earn a sliver of his approval. The scene that greeted me stopped me in my tracks. My father and Daniel were sitting at the kitchen table, laughing. The greasy, delicious smell of pepperoni and cheese filled the air. In the center of the table was a large Double Dave's pizza box. "What's this?" I asked, my voice small. Daniel just grinned, his mouth full. My father didn't even look up from his slice. "Celebrating Daniel's touchdown at the scrimmage today," he said. My heart sank. "Is there any for me?" He finally looked at me, but his eyes were flat, dismissive. He gestured with his chin toward the refrigerator. "There's leftover beef stew from Monday night. Eat that." I stood there for a moment, the A+ on my report card suddenly feeling worthless. My mother was at the counter. She saw the whole thing. She saw the hope drain from my face. She said nothing. She just quietly refilled my father's glass of sweet tea, the ice cubes clinking softly against the glass. That was her role, the silent accomplice, the keeper of a toxic peace. My existence was a constant exercise in reading the room, in trying to make myself invisible so as not to cause a ripple in their perfect world. My father didn't just control the food, he monitored everything. If I took my beat-up Chevy to a friend's house, he checked the odometer when I got back to make sure I hadn't strayed. My mother would clean my room, and I'd later find my diary tucked back in its hiding spot, slightly out of place. I wasn't a daughter, I was a subject under surveillance. My dreams became my only escape route, and my dream had a name: the United States Army. The high school's JROTC program was my lifeline. Every mile I ran on the track, every push-up on the gym floor, was a step further away from that cold, quiet house. It was the one place where the rules were clear and fair, where effort was rewarded, not ignored. When the acceptance letter from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point arrived, it felt like a pardon. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope, heavy with the weight of my future. My hands were shaking as I handed it to my father, my heart hammering against my ribs. He took it, his eyes scanning the formal text. Then he let out a short, sharp laugh, a huff of contempt. "West Point," he sneered, the word dripping with disdain. "They only take the weak ones who can't make it in the real world. You're just running away from your responsibilities here." He crumpled the letter, the single greatest achievement of my life, and tossed it into the trash can by his desk. It landed amongst coffee grounds and junk mail. The day I left for basic training, there was no tearful goodbye. No hugs, no, "We're so proud of you." Just an icy silence and his dismissive glare from the doorway as I hauled my duffel bag into the taxi. That was the last I saw of them for a long time. There was only one person who ever truly saw me: my grandfather. He was a retired Marine, a man carved from granite and integrity. It was a small plot of land in Chesapeake, Virginia, that they were trying to take from me now. He's the one who taught me how to read a compass, how to bait a hook, how to be still and listen to the world. Before he passed, he gave me his old brass military compass. Etched onto the back were two words: "Hold steady." When my father's words cut me down, I'd clutch that compass in my pocket, the cool metal a secret anchor. When my mother would sigh and tell me I should be grateful for the roof over my head, I'd stare at the unwavering needle. His legacy wasn't just the land. It was a command, a directive for survival. Hold steady, Anna. West Point and Ranger School forged me into something new. They hammered me into steel. In the Army, respect was earned through competence, not blind obedience. Your last name didn't matter. Your performance did. For the first time, I felt like I belonged. But Afghanistan left its own map of wounds, scars that weren't visible. I lost my brother in arms, Captain Mason Reed. He was my best friend, the brother I should have had. He died right next to me in an IED blast that sent shrapnel into my knee and a concussive wave through my soul. The pain of that loss settled deep inside me, a ghost that walked with me every day. It had a name: PTSD. When I came home on leave, I brought Mason's ashes with me and a retired military working dog, a Belgian Malinois named Ranger, who had saved my life more than once. My father saw me struggling. He saw the nightmares that left me drenched in sweat, the way I'd flinch at loud noises. He saw the pain in my eyes, and instead of offering a word of comfort, a hand on my shoulder, he saw an opportunity to be right. He cornered me in the kitchen one night. "See," he said, his voice laced with triumph, "I told you the Army would break you. I told you you weren't strong enough." He took my deepest wound and twisted the knife just to prove his point. If you've ever had your pain used against you, or had your greatest accomplishments dismissed by the very people who should have been cheering you on, please support this story by hitting the like button, and in the comments, just type a simple, "Hold steady." It'll let me know I'm not alone in this fight. Trapped between the ghosts of a war I'd fought overseas and the relentless Cold War of my own home, there was nothing left to do. I was surrounded, outgunned, and bleeding out emotionally. There was only one mission objective left: escape. But how? How could I possibly get out? The answer to the question, "How do I get out?" wasn't a single event. It was a war of attrition, fought one exhausting day at a time. My escape wasn't a sprint. It was a marathon paved with lonely nights and quiet sacrifices. My first year at West Point was hell on earth, but it was a hell of my own choosing, and that made all the difference. The winters in upstate New York are brutal, a biting, relentless cold that seeps into your bones. The other cadets, the ones from wealthy families in Connecticut or California, had expensive, high-tech winter coats from brands like Patagonia or the North Face. I had a standard-issue jacket that felt about as warm as a cotton t-shirt. I couldn't afford anything better. My meager cadet stipend went entirely toward books and supplies. To make ends meet, I took on a work-study job cleaning the barracks. I remember one night, long after taps had played, I was mopping the long, empty hallway of Eisenhower Barracks. My hands were numb from the cold water, and the smell of pine disinfectant hung heavy in the air. My cell phone buzzed in my pocket. It was my mother. My first thought, a foolish flicker of hope, was that she was calling to see if I was okay. She wasn't. "Anna," she said, her voice bright and cheerful, a tone she never used with me. "I have wonderful news. Your father agreed to co-sign a loan for Daniel. He's getting a brand new Ford Mustang, a convertible." The pride in her voice was a physical thing, a punch to the gut. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't ask if I was warm. She just wanted to share in the glory of her favored son. I mumbled a congratulations, my own voice sounding hollow and distant in the echoing hallway. After I hung up, I just stood there for a moment, the cold of the mop handle seeping into my frozen fingers. And in that cold, sterile hallway, I made a silent vow. I would never, ever ask them for anything again. If West Point was tough, Ranger School was a different level of brutal. It's designed to break you, to strip you down to your absolute core and see what's left. I was one of only a handful of women in my class, a fact that made me a target. I had to work twice as hard just to be considered half as good. Every patrol, every ruck march, every sleepless night was a test not just of my physical endurance, but of my right to even be there. During one particularly miserable training exercise in the swamps of Florida, we were slogging through waist-deep, murky water, exhausted, starving, and soaked to the bone. One of the instructors, an old-school sergeant major with a face like a leather boot, singled me out. He got right up in my face, his breath smelling of chewing tobacco. "George," he growled, "you don't belong here. Go home and bake some cookies." Every muscle in my body screamed for rest. Every rational thought told me to give up. But I just looked him straight in the eye, the swamp water dripping from my chin, and said in the steadiest voice I could manage, "I will complete this course, Sergeant Major." He stared at me for a long moment, then just grunted and moved on. On graduation day, when he handed me my Ranger tab, he didn't smile. He didn't say congratulations. He just gave me a short, sharp nod. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible. But it was the first piece of genuine recognition I had ever earned from a man like him, from a man like my father. And it meant more to me than any hollow praise they could have ever offered. The vow I made in that West Point hallway was tested a few years later. I was driving the old Chevy C10 pickup my grandfather had left me, a trusty beast of a truck. The radiator blew on a desolate stretch of highway somewhere outside Richmond, Virginia. I managed to coast into a run-down, single-pump gas station just as steam started pouring from under the hood. I'd spent my last $20 on gas 100 miles back. I was stranded. Swallowing my pride, a bitter, painful lump in my throat, I made the call. I called home. My mother answered. "Mom," I started, my voice tight with shame. "My truck broke down. I'm stuck. I was wondering if I could possibly borrow $100. A long, weary sigh came through the phone. It was the sound of an inconvenience, not concern. "Anna, your father's watching the game. You know how he gets when he's interrupted." Her voice was flat. "You chose this path, Anna. You need to learn to handle your own problems." Besides, she added as an afterthought, "Your father just had to pay the insurance premium on Daniel's new Mustang. Money's tight." And then, a sound louder than the rain that had just started to fall. The sharp, final click of her hanging up. I nearly broke that night. I sat in the cab of my dead truck, the rain drumming on the roof, and I finally let myself cry. I cried out of sheer frustration, out of the bone-deep loneliness of it all. I was an officer in the United States Army, but I was stranded and worthless because I didn't have $100. The irony was crushing. As I sat there shivering, A memory surfaced. It was from a military history class at West Point. The professor was a retired colonel, a man who had seen combat in 3 different wars. He had seen me struggling, staying late in the library, pushing myself to the brink. He'd asked me to stay after class one day. "Cadet George," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Don't ever let where you came from define who you are. In this army, we don't care who your father is. We care what you can do. Let your actions speak for you." His words echoed in the cab of that truck. Let your actions speak for you. Wiping my eyes, I took a deep breath. Crying was a luxury I couldn't afford. I took my grandfather's compass out of my pocket. It was the original, the one he gave me. But in my duffel bag, I had a second government-issue compass I'd been given at Ranger School. It wasn't the same, but it pointed north just as well. I walked into the greasy office of the gas station. The old man behind the counter looked up from his newspaper. I placed the spare compass on the counter. "Sir," I said, "this is a military-grade Lensatic compass. It's worth over $100. Would you give me $75 for it?" He picked it up, felt the weight of it in his hand, and looked from the compass to me. He saw the uniform I was wearing. He nodded slowly. $75, he said. It was enough to get the radiator patched and buy a half tank of gas. It was enough to keep going. Driving away from that gas station, with a patched-up radiator and an empty passenger seat, I had never felt more alone. But the Army taught me something my family never did. Loyalty is unconditional. And sometimes you don't find your family in the house you grew up in. Sometimes you find them in the barracks, in the trenches, in the middle of a war zone. My real family was forged under fire and pressure-tested in the crucible of service. It was Captain Mason Reed, a man with a booming laugh and kind eyes, who shared his last Hershey bar with me during a grueling 72-hour patrol in the mountains of Afghanistan when our rations were running low. It was the Army chaplain, a quiet, thoughtful man who listened without judgment as I talked about my grandfather, the one person I felt I had truly lost. And it was Ranger. After the IED blast, the Belgian Malinois who had been my partner was medically retired due to his own trauma. I adopted him without a second thought. He was a 70-pound shadow of pure loyalty, a furry, breathing reminder that I had survived. Ranger didn't care about my rank or the medals on my chest. He just cared that I came home at the end of the day. His presence, the simple weight of his head on my lap, was a comfort more profound than any words my parents could have ever offered. The first Thanksgiving I spent away from home, I was 25, a young lieutenant stationed at Fort Bragg. It was a raw, gray day in North Carolina. I had called home out of a lingering sense of duty, a foolish hope that this year might be different. My mother answered, her voice distracted. "Oh, Anna," she said, "we're driving down to Florida to spend the holiday with Daniel and his new girlfriend. There just isn't room for you to come along." It wasn't an apology. It was a statement of fact. I hung up, the familiar coldness seeping into my small barracks room. I remember staring at the sad-looking frozen turkey dinner I'd bought from the commissary, resigning myself to a lonely meal in front of an old TV. But then there was a loud knock on my door. It was Mason Reed. He took one look at the frozen dinner in my hand and shook his head. "Absolutely not, Lieutenant," he said, a grin spreading across his face. "My wife, Sarah, just pulled her famous pumpkin pie out of the oven, and she made it very clear that if I don't bring you home with me, I'll be sleeping on the couch for a week." That evening, I found myself squeezed into a small, warm, chaotic house just off base. It smelled of roasted turkey, stuffing, and cinnamon. The place was filled with other soldiers, single guys, young couples, people whose families were 1,000 miles away. We were a makeshift platoon of strays. We ate turkey and mashed potatoes off paper plates, drank cheap beer, and told loud, ridiculous stories. We laughed until our sides hurt. Sitting there, surrounded by the easy camaraderie of people who understood the sacrifices we all made, I felt something I had never felt before at my own family's dinner table. I felt like I belonged. Mason wasn't just my commanding officer or my comrade, he became the brother I never had. He saw the parts of me that I kept hidden. During our tour in Afghanistan, We were in the communications tent when an email from my father popped up on my phone. The subject line was just one word: debt. It was a long, rambling message about how I owed him for the cost of raising me, demanding I send a portion of my combat pay home. Before I could even process the shame and anger, Mason reached over, took the phone from my hand, and deleted the email without reading past the first line. He looked me straight in the eye. "Don't you dare reply to that," he said, his voice fierce with protective anger. "You don't owe them a damn thing, Anna. You are a commissioned officer in the United States Army. You will not let anyone, and I mean anyone, disrespect you like that." He gave me the respect my own father never would. When he was killed, a part of me died with him. Kneeling beside him in the dust and chaos, I made him a promise. I promised I would live a life worthy of his sacrifice, that I would be strong, not just for the army, but for myself, and that I would never again allow anyone, not even my own family, to make me feel small. But promises are easier to make than to keep. In the months after his death, I was in a tailspin. The PTSD was a relentless monster, dragging me under in the dead of night. I finally broke down and went to see the chaplain. I didn't go as Major George, I went as Anna, a woman who was shattered. I told him everything. About my family, about the guilt I felt over Mason's death, about the gnawing feeling that I had been abandoned by my parents, by my country, maybe even by God. He listened patiently, his hands folded on his desk. When I was finished, my voice raw and hoarse, he didn't offer platitudes or easy answers. He simply opened his well-worn Bible that sat on his desk. He turned to the Psalms and read a single verse, Psalm 27:10. His voice was calm and steady, a lighthouse in my storm. "Though my father and mother forsake me," he read, "the Lord will receive me." Those words hit me with the force of a physical blow. Though my father and mother forsake me, it was a permission slip, a validation of my deepest, unspoken pain. It was an acknowledgement from the universe itself that I wasn't crazy. I wasn't the problem. That verse became another anchor, just like my grandfather's compass. It gave me the strength to believe that even if I had been forsaken by the people who were supposed to love me most, I was not and would never be truly alone. That peace, hard-won and fragile, became my sanctuary. A sanctuary I thought would last. But the Cold War I had run from was not over. It was simply regrouping for another attack. The peace I had found was fragile, a thin sheet of ice over deep, cold water. I knew it wouldn't last. The Cold War I had escaped wasn't over. It had just been waiting for an opportunity to launch a new offensive. The first shot was fired through a phone call I almost didn't answer. I was back at my duty station, prepping my platoon for a field training exercise, when an unfamiliar number from my old hometown area code flashed on the screen. I answered cautiously. It was Mrs. Whitaker, my grandfather's old next-door neighbor, a sweet woman who always used to give me cookies. Her voice was thin and trembling. "Anna, dear, I don't mean to bother you," she started, her voice barely a whisper. "But you need to know what's being said. Your father. Oh, Anna, he's telling the most awful things about you." My blood ran cold. She explained that my father had launched a full-blown character assassination campaign against me. At the Rotary Club meetings, at the corner store, even during the Sunday morning Bible study class he taught, he was painting a picture of me as a thankless runaway daughter. He told people I had abandoned the family in their time of need. He twisted my military service into a source of shame, telling anyone who would listen that it was a disgrace because I had stopped sending money home to them. But the worst part, the part that felt like a deliberate, tactical strike, was how he used my deepest wound against me. "He's telling everyone the war broke you," Mrs. Whitaker whispered, her voice cracking. "He's saying you're unstable, damaged goods. He's making you sound dangerous, dear." He was weaponizing my PTSD. He was taking the invisible scars of my service and parading them in front of the town as proof that I was the problem, not him. The promise I made to Mason echoed in my ears. Don't let anyone disrespect you like that. I requested emergency leave, my hands steady as I filled out the forms, but a cold fury was building inside me. I drove the 5 hours straight to Fayetteville, the hum of the tires on the asphalt, a countdown to the inevitable confrontation. I didn't change out of my uniform. This time, I wasn't coming home as their daughter. I was coming as an officer whose honor was under attack. I walked into the house without knocking. My father was in his recliner, the blue light of Fox News flickering across his face. He muted the TV with the remote, the sudden silence deafening. "Dad," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "I hear you've been telling lies about me." His eyes narrowed. "You dare call me a liar in my own house?" My mother emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, her face a mask of practiced concern. "Anna, how could you?" she gasped. "Your father is just worried about you. That's all this is." "Worried?" I shot back, my voice rising despite my efforts to control it. "He's not worried. He's destroying my reputation." My father pushed himself out of his chair, a slow, deliberate movement. And there it was again. That smirk. The weapon of choice. "You don't have a reputation here," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You're just an ungrateful child who ran away. You think those cheap medals on your chest mean anything in this house?" This was it. The moment I had been subconsciously preparing for since I was a teenager. I knew his playbook. I knew escalation was his only move when challenged. As he spoke, my thumb discreetly pressed a small button on the side of a device clipped to the lapel of my jacket, disguised as a tie tack. A tiny blue light blinked once and then went dark. The audio and video were rolling. "I'm not going to let you do this anymore," I said, my voice dropping back to that unnerving calm. My composure seemed to enrage him more than any shouting match could have. It was a rejection of his power, a refusal to play his game. His face turned a blotchy red. "You challenge me!" he roared, taking a step forward. "You stand there in that ridiculous costume and you challenge me in my own home." And then his hand came up. It moved in a blur, a flash of righteous fury. The crack of his palm against my cheek echoed in the small living room. My head snapped to the side, the impact slamming me against the wall. Stars exploded behind my eyes. My mother shrieked, but her cry wasn't for me, it was for the neighbors. "Oh my God, Frank, people will hear." I pushed myself off the wall, tasting the coppery tang of blood in my mouth. I stood up straight, my spine rigid, and looked at them both. My mother wouldn't meet my eyes. She turned away, her hand fluttering to her throat in a gesture of pure, theatrical panic. She was already rewriting the story in her head, casting herself as the horrified bystander. I said only one thing, my voice clear and steady despite the ringing in my ears. "It's done." And I turned and walked out the door. 2 days later, I was at my grandfather's farm in Virginia, trying to find a moment of peace, when a sheriff's deputy pulled up the long gravel driveway. My first thought was that Mrs. Whitaker had called them, that he was here to take my statement. He wasn't. He wasn't here to arrest my father. He was here for me. He handed me a crisp, white envelope. My name was typed on the front. It was a summons to appear in court. My parents were suing me. The document was a masterpiece of legal cruelty. It alleged that I had abandoned the property. It claimed that due to my unstable mental state, the very lie my father had been spreading, I was unfit to manage the asset. They were petitioning the court to strip me of my ownership of my grandfather's land and grant them conservatorship. It was the perfect move, a checkmate. In a single, vicious act, they could steal my inheritance and get the state to legally validate their lie that I was crazy. Holding that summons in my hand, the thin paper felt heavier than body armor. It wasn't just a legal document, it was a declaration of war. Holding that summons in my hand, the thin paper felt heavier than body armor. It was a declaration of war. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. The part of me that had always flinched, that had always hoped for a different outcome, finally went silent. I didn't cry. I'd shed all my tears during my first year at West Point. What was left was something colder, sharper. It was rage, forged into the clean, hard edge of resolve. My training kicked in. The first step in any operation is reconnaissance. I got on my laptop and researched the top 5 real estate attorneys in Fayetteville. I I made the calls from my small, sterile apartment off base, the one place in the world that was truly mine. The first lawyer I called, a man with a folksy drawl, actually chuckled when I explained the situation. "Little lady," he said, not unkindly, "you're planning on suing your own folks here in Cumberland County? Godspeed and good luck." He declined the case. The second and third lawyers gave me polite but firm rejections, citing conflicts of interest I knew were just excuses. The fourth one, an older gentleman, took a different approach. "I know your father," he said, his voice laced with paternalistic disapproval. "He's a good church-going man. Perhaps you should reconsider this course of action. Go home. Talk to him." He was telling me to surrender before the first shot was even fired. The fifth lawyer hung up on me as soon as I said my father's name. 5 calls, 5 rejections. The message was clear. I was on my own. The system I had sworn to uphold wouldn't protect me here. My father's influence was a fortress, and its walls were too high for me to scale alone. I closed my laptop with a quiet snap. Fine, so be it. They were all accustomed to the quiet, scared version of Anna George, the little girl who would eat leftover stew and say, "Thank you." The teenager who would accept insults as concern. They had never met Major George, and if no one else would fight for me, I would do it myself. I immediately switched from emotional response to mission planning mode. Assess the situation, identify available assets, execute the objective. The objective was no longer just survival, it was victory. My first stop was the USAA Bank branch, the one frequented by soldiers and their families. I walked in, my back straight, and requested 10 years of my complete financial history. The bank teller, a young woman with a friendly smile, probably thought I was preparing for a mortgage application. She had no idea I was gathering ammunition. I spent that entire night at the small dining table in my apartment. The floor was covered in stacks of paper, a decade of my life reduced to debits and credits. I worked with the same methodical focus I would use to plan a raid, fueled by black coffee and sheer determination. And slowly, a story began to emerge from the numbers. Here it was, in black and white. Quarterly property tax payments to Chesapeake County, Virginia, drawn directly from my military checking account every year without fail. Here was the $5,000 payment to a roofing contractor from 2021 after a hurricane damaged the farmhouse. Here were the monthly electricity bills, the insurance payments, all of it paid by me from bases thousands of miles away. They accused me of abandonment. These papers were the irrefutable proof that I had been the one quietly upholding the family's responsibility, carrying the burden they pretended to bear. Honor, I realized, isn't found in loud proclamations at church. It's found in the quiet consistency of your actions. While sorting through a box of personal documents, my fingers brushed against cool, heavy metal. It was my grandfather's brass compass. I picked it up, its weight familiar and grounding in my palm. I flipped it over. Hold steady. The words were no longer a gentle comfort from a beloved memory. They felt different now. They were a direct order, a combat command. Hold steady. Hold the line of truth. Hold your position. Do not let their chaos and lies compromise your moral azimuth. I wasn't going to attack them with emotion. I wasn't going to scream or cry. I was going to be a professional. I would present the facts. The courtroom was my new battlefield. The evidence was my fortifications. The truth was my weapon, and my composure was my body armor. The night before the court date, I prepared my uniform. This wasn't a psychological tactic to sway a judge. It was for me. It was a declaration of my own identity, a reminder of who I had become in spite of them. I carefully pinned each ribbon onto the jacket, each one a silent testament. The Army Commendation Medal, the Afghanistan Campaign Medal, the Purple Heart for the IED blast that took Mason and nearly took my leg, and finally, the Distinguished Service Cross. Each piece of polished metal and colored silk told a story of service, of sacrifice, of honor earned. My father had called me worthless. He had called me damaged goods. This uniform, this collection of stories, was the living, breathing rebuttal to his every lie. It was my service record, my history, written in metal and fabric, It carried a weight that no lie could ever hope to match. Before I walk into that courtroom, I need to know you're with me. If you believe that our actions, not someone else's opinions, define who we are, hit that like button. And in the comments, just write 2 simple words that mean the world to me. Present arms. Let the world know you stand for honor. Tomorrow, I wouldn't be walking into that courthouse to beg for sympathy. I was walking in to present my record. My case was ready. The morning of the hearing, as I hung my ASU jacket, ready for the day, I knew this wasn't just about a piece of land. It was about my entire life. I was walking into that courthouse not as their daughter, but as the officer they never believed I could be. And I was going to present my case. As I walked into the courtroom for the first day of the hearing, I could feel the ripple effect of my uniform. It was exactly as I'd anticipated. A low murmur spread through the gallery. I heard someone whisper, "She's trying to intimidate the judge." My parents and their lawyers seized on it immediately. My father leaned in, his voice a loud, conspiratorial hiss. "You see, Your Honor, it's all a performance. Theatrical. She's not stable." He even had the audacity to point toward my face. "Look at that bruise. I'd bet my life she did that to herself for sympathy." My mother, playing her part to perfection, chimed in, her voice trembling with manufactured fragility. "We're just so worried," she said, dabbing at a dry eye with a handkerchief. "We only want what's best for her. But she abandoned us. She pushed us away." They were a well-oiled machine, painting a portrait of me as an ungrateful, mentally disturbed veteran, a problem child who needed to be managed. I didn't react. I didn't look at them. I kept my shoulders back, my eyes fixed on the judge's bench, my expression neutral. My silence was a void they couldn't fill with their noise. Their first witness was my mother. She walked to the stand, a picture of devout, long-suffering motherhood. And then she began to cry. They were perfect, cinematic tears rolling down her cheeks on cue. "Anna was always a difficult child," she sniffled, looking directly at the judge, her voice catching with sorrow. "We gave her everything. A good home, a Christian upbringing, and she repaid us by running away, joining the military, and just forgetting about us." She made it sound like I had joined a gang, not the United States Army. Their lawyer, a slick man in an expensive suit, approached her gently. "Ma'am," he asked, his voice dripping with sympathy, "in your opinion, is your daughter capable of managing a financial asset like this property?" My mother shook her head, a single perfect tear tracing a path through her makeup. "No," she whispered. "Not anymore. Ever since she came back from Afghanistan, she's changed. She has a temper. She's violent." She paused, letting the word hang in the air. "She frightens me." She was using my service, my sacrifice, the very trauma inflicted upon me in the defense of this country, as a weapon to paint me as a monster. She was twisting Mason's death into a tool for her own greed. I watched her performance, and for the first time, I didn't feel anger. I felt a profound and weary pity. She was so trapped in the world my father had built that she would burn her own daughter to the ground just to keep him warm. The lawyer finished his questioning. The judge turned his tired eyes to me. "The defendant," he said, "do you wish to cross-examine the witness?" Before I could rise, their lawyer interjected. "Your Honor, if I may, given Anna's apparent—" The judge held up a single hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. His gaze was fixed on me. "Counselor," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable edge of command. "I am speaking to Major George." The silence that followed was absolute. It was as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. That title, that name, spoken with such deliberate respect, redrew the lines of battle. It was a shield, deflecting every lie she had just told. In that single moment, the judge stripped me of the role they had forced upon me. I wasn't the difficult child or the frightening veteran. I was an officer of the U.S. Army. My father's jaw tightened. My mother's performance faltered. The tears stopped instantly. The judge continued, his eyes still on me. "Major, your witness." I have no questions for this witness, Your Honor, I said, my voice clear and steady. A murmur went through the room. My father smirked, assuming I was retreating. He thought I had no fight in me. I stood up, my back ramrod straight. It was my turn to present my case. I wasn't going to talk about my feelings. I wasn't going to talk about my childhood. I was a soldier, and I was going to present the facts, the intelligence, the unshakable truth. But before I could utter a single word, the judge leaned forward slightly, squinting at the array of ribbons and medals on my chest. "Major," he said, his voice laced with a new kind of curiosity. "Forgive my old eyes, but is that—" The whispering in the gallery changed its tone. It was no longer judgmental. It was awestruck. I heard a man in the back row gasp. "My God," he said to his wife. "That's the Distinguished Service Cross. It is the second highest military decoration that can be awarded to a member of the United States Army for extreme gallantry and risk of life in actual combat." My father, sensing he was losing control of the room, tried to launch a counteroffensive. "She's just trying to distract you," he blurted out, his voice too loud. "It's all part of the act." The judge's gaze snapped from my uniform to my father. The tiredness was gone from his eyes, replaced by a cold, hard fire. He silenced my father with a single, icy glare. "Abandonment is a powerful accusation, sir," the judge said, his voice low and dangerous, especially when leveled against an individual who has, by all appearances, dedicated her entire adult life to the service of this nation. In that moment, with the judge's words hanging in the air, the courtroom was no longer my father's stage. It was mine. He had built his case on lies and whispers. I had built mine on cold, hard facts, and I was about to present them. With the judge's words hanging in the air, the courtroom was no longer my father's stage. It was mine. He had built his case on lies and whispers. I had built mine on cold, hard facts, and I was about to present them. "Your Honor," I began, my voice even and measured, "regarding the plaintiff's claim of property abandonment, I would like to submit Exhibit A." I walked to the clerk's desk and placed a thick, neatly organized binder on the counter. It was the result of my all-night mission, my 10 years of financial records. This binder contains certified bank statements from my USAA account, detailing every property tax payment made to Chesapeake County, Virginia, for the past decade, starting the year I graduated from West Point. It also includes receipts for major repairs, including a new roof in 2021, and all utility payments for the property. The judge put on his reading glasses and began flipping through the pages, his expression growing more grim with each one. He looked up, his eyes passing over my parents before settling on their lawyer. "Counselor," he said dryly, "the property appears to be anything but abandoned. In fact, it seems Major George has been a more diligent caretaker than many full-time residents." He then looked back at me, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Major George," he said slowly, "I know your name. I was the presiding official at an awards ceremony at Fort Bragg a few years ago. You were decorated for gallantry. You received the Distinguished Service Cross." He paused, letting his words sink in. Then his gaze drifted to my parents. "It was quite a memorable event. I don't recall seeing your parents in attendance." A collective gasp went through the gallery. The silence was deafening. My mother's face flushed a deep, mortified crimson. My father just stared, his mouth slightly agape. It was true. They hadn't come. They'd said it was inconvenient. "Furthermore, Your Honor," I continued, pressing my advantage, "regarding the plaintiff's accusations of me being violent and unstable, I would like to submit Exhibit B for the court's review." I handed a small USB drive to the clerk. "This is a video file, Your Honor." The clerk plugged it into the court system, and the large monitor that had been dormant sprang to life. The entire courtroom held its breath as the shaky first-person footage appeared. They saw my father's living room. They saw his face, contorted with rage, his skin blotchy and red. They heard his voice, dripping with venom as he spat out the words, "You think you're better than me?" They heard him scream, "You think those cheap medals mean anything here?" And then, with horrifying clarity, they saw his hand fly toward the camera. The screen tumbled into a blur of motion, and the sharp, ugly sound of the slap crackled through the courtroom speakers. It was followed by my mother's panicked shriek, "Oh my God, Frank, the neighbors will hear." The video showed me stumbling back, pushing myself off the wall. It showed the blood trickling from the corner of my mouth. And it recorded my voice, impossibly steady, as I looked at him and said, "This is done." The video ended. The screen went black. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by my mother's quiet, horrified sob. My father's lawyer's desperate attempt to claim his client was acting in self-defense dissolved into absurdity. The video was undeniable. Their lawyer, sweating now, tried a different tactic, a last-ditch effort to appeal to emotion. "Major George," he asked, his voice pleading, "if you loved your family so much, why did you leave home in the first place?" The entire room turned to look at me, expecting a tearful explanation, a dramatic speech. I met the lawyer's gaze without flinching. "I left for 2 reasons," I said, my voice clear and ringing with conviction. "To survive and to serve." The judge nodded slowly, a deep understanding in his weary eyes. He looked at their lawyer. "Serving one's country and protecting oneself from abuse," the judge stated, his voice flat and final, "can hardly be construed as abandonment, counselor." And then he delivered the final blow. "This court will call one final witness to the stand." The heavy doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. My army chaplain, in his full dress uniform, walked calmly and purposefully down the aisle. My parents stared, utterly stunned. Their carefully constructed narrative was crumbling before their eyes. The chaplain was sworn in. He spoke with quiet authority about my character, my dedication, and my courage. He spoke of my struggle with PTSD after Mason's death, not as a weakness, but as a wound of war, an honorable scar. My father's lawyer saw one last, desperate opening. "So you admit she has issues, Chaplain?" he asked, a triumphant sneer on his face. "You admit she's damaged?" The chaplain didn't answer him. Instead, he turned his compassionate gaze from me to my parents, sitting brokenly in the front row. "Sir, we all come back from war with issues. We all carry something home with us." He then turned back to the judge. "But as for the charge of abandonment, Your Honor," he said, his voice now like steel, "Major George did not abandon them. They abandoned her first." The gavel fell, and the sound echoed like a final gunshot in a long war. I had won. But as I watched my parents shrink in their seats, stripped of their power and their pride, there was no surge of joy. There was only a vast, quiet emptiness. The battle was over, but now I had to figure out how to live in the silence that followed. The judge's final gavel strike wasn't a thunderclap of victory. It was the quiet final gunshot in a war that had lasted my entire life. The ruling came as no surprise. It was a simple confirmation of the facts. The judge dismissed my parents' lawsuit entirely. Full ownership of my grandfather's farm was affirmed as mine. And based on the video evidence, the court issued a restraining order against my father, forcing him to stay 500 feet away from me, along with a fine for assault. Losing all control, my father finally broke. He surged to his feet, his face purple with rage, and screamed across the courtroom, "You've destroyed this family!" But his words had lost their power. They were just the empty echoes of a tyrant who had been deposed. The judge banged the gavel one last time, silencing him. He looked at me, a deep, weary respect in his eyes. "Thank you for your service, Major," he said. I didn't smile. I didn't pump my fist in the air. There was no triumphant surge of joy. I just felt tired, bone tired. I methodically gathered my files, slid them into my briefcase, gave a respectful nod to the judge, and walked away. The battle was over. But as I stepped out into the bright North Carolina sun, all I felt was the vast, quiet emptiness of the battlefield after the fighting stops. I thought the legal decision would be the end of it, but my father wasn't a man who accepted defeat. He just moved the conflict to a new front, the court of public opinion. He launched a second smear campaign, this time casting himself as the victim. He told everyone at church and in town that his unstable, vindictive daughter had used legal tricks to steal the family home, leaving him and his wife destitute. He painted me as a heartless, unchristian child who had turned her back on her elderly parents. But this time, the seeds of his lies fell on barren ground. The video, the testimony, the judge's ruling, the truth had its own power now. The narrative had shifted. Neighbors who once averted their eyes when I drove past now gave me small, hesitant waves. The tide of public sympathy, which he had always controlled, was turning against him. A few days later, I was at the Home Depot in Fayetteville, loading bags of concrete mix into the bed of my old Chevy truck. I was planning to repair the front steps of the farmhouse. An older man in a faded Vietnam veteran cap stopped his cart next to my truck. He looked at me, then at the Ranger tab sticker on my rear window. He simply touched the brim of his cap. "You hold steady, Major," he said, his voice rough but kind. I just nodded, a lump forming in my throat. This quiet acknowledgement from a stranger, a fellow soldier, felt more like family than anything I had ever known. The final test came a week after the hearing. I was at the farm, breathing in the clean Virginia air, when I saw a familiar, gleaming black Cadillac crunching up the gravel driveway. My heart seized for a moment. The restraining order was only for my father, not my mother. She was his final weapon. He got out of the car and stood by the property line, a simmering, impotent statue just beyond the 500-foot legal limit. My mother got out and walked toward me, her face arranged into a mask of desperate sorrow. This wasn't a visit of apology, it was a mission of manipulation. "Anna," she began, her voice quivering, "please, your father, he isn't taking this well. His health is failing." She wrung her hands. "We're in financial trouble. The legal fees. You can't just throw us out on the street. We're your family." There it was, the final play. The appeal to guilt, to a sense of duty that they themselves had never honored. They were hoping that the little girl who just wanted her parents' love was still in there somewhere, that she could be guilted back into her cage. This was the last boundary I had to draw. I took a deep breath, the scent of pine and damp earth filling my lungs. It was the smell of my grandfather's legacy. It was the smell of my freedom. "No," I said. The word was quiet, but it was absolute. It was a locked door. Her face crumpled. "But Anna, we have nowhere else to go." "I paid the taxes on this land for 10 years, I said, my voice as calm and steady as the compass in my pocket. "I sent money home every month until the day my father told me my service was a disgrace. I have given enough." From the edge of the property, my father, hearing my refusal, finally erupted. "You're turning your back on your family," he bellowed, his voice cracking with fury. I looked at them one last time, at the raging, defeated man and the weeping, manipulative woman. And I felt the last chains of obligation fall away. "No," I said, my voice clear and final, not with anger, but with a sad, hard-won clarity. "You taught me the most valuable lesson of my life." I paused, letting them absorb it. "You made me strong enough to stand on my own. And now, I finally am." I turned, walked up the steps I was about to repair, and went into the house. I closed the heavy oak door behind me, not a slam, not an act of anger, just an ending. The sound of the lock clicking into place was the quietest, most powerful sound I had ever heard. It wasn't the end of a fight. It was the beginning of peace. The sound of the lock clicking into place wasn't the end of a war. It was the beginning of peace, but I quickly learned that peace isn't something you find, it's something you build. Board by board, nail by nail. I spent the rest of my leave at my grandfather's farm, not resting, but working. My hands, trained to handle weapons and read maps, learned the new, satisfying language of manual labor. I found a kind of therapy in the simple, honest work. I replaced the rotten wood on the porch swing where my grandfather used to sit, sanding the new pine until it was smooth to the touch. I gave the entire fence a fresh coat of white paint, the repetitive motion of the brush calming the storm that had raged inside me for so long. My first project, the most important one, was installing a new flagpole in the front yard. I dug the hole myself, mixed the concrete, and set the pole until it was perfectly plumb. As I raised the American flag for the first time, watching it unfurl against the vast, blue Virginia sky, I felt a connection that ran deeper than blood. I felt my grandfather's pride. I felt Mason's camaraderie. I felt the presence of every soldier I'd ever served with. This flag on my land was a symbol of everything I had fought for, both overseas and in that courtroom. Every swing of the hammer wasn't just driving a nail, it was an affirmation. I am here. This is mine. I built this. As my leave was coming to an end, I received an unexpected phone call. It was the principal of the local high school. Word of the court case had spread, and he asked if I would be willing to speak at their Veterans Day assembly. I hesitated for only a moment before agreeing. Standing on that auditorium stage, looking out at the sea of young, hopeful faces, I didn't talk about firefights or heroic battles. I didn't tell war stories. I talked about a different kind of war, a quieter, more personal one. Courage isn't always about charging into enemy fire, I told them. Sometimes the greatest courage is the quiet kind. It's the courage to hold steady when the people who are supposed to build you up try to tear you down. It's the courage to know your own worth when no one else seems to see it. And it's the courage to walk away from a place that is hurting you, even if that place is called home. I looked out at them, at the future generation of soldiers, leaders, and citizens. Honor, I said, my voice ringing with a conviction I'd earned in blood and tears. Honor is not something that is given to you. It's something you build every single day with your actions. Let your actions speak for you. After the assembly, as students were filing out, a young girl, maybe a freshman, approached me hesitantly. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Ma'am," she whispered, clutching her books to her chest. "What you said about family, not understanding." Her voice broke. "Me too." I looked at this girl, at her brave, fragile face, and I saw a reflection of myself 20 years ago. The same hurt, the same desperate need to be seen. I knelt, bringing myself down to her level. I unzipped a pocket on my backpack, pulled out a spare Ranger tab patch, the small black and gold arc I had carried for good luck, and pressed it into her hand. "Hold steady," I said softly, closing her fingers around it. "Let your actions speak for you." She looked down at the patch, then back up at me, a flicker of strength dawning in her eyes. In that moment, watching her stand a little straighter, I understood. My legacy wasn't the pain I had inherited from my parents. That was their story, not mine. My legacy would be the strength I chose to leave behind. It would be in the quiet moments of connection, in passing a piece of my own hard-won resilience onto the next person who needed it. This story ends on a cool autumn evening in Chesapeake. I'm sitting on the porch swing I rebuilt, the gentle rocking a peaceful rhythm in the quiet twilight. Ranger, my loyal companion, is lying at my feet, his head resting on my boots, a warm, reassuring weight. The porch light I installed myself clicks on, casting a warm, golden glow over the steps. It's not a beacon for anyone else. It's not a signal to the world. It's just a light. A light that proves I finally made it home. A home that is no longer a battlefield of control and pain, but a sanctuary I claimed and rebuilt with my own two hands. The peace was won, not in the noisy clamor of a courtroom victory, but here in the profound quiet of a life freely chosen. That light, finally, is all mine. That light on my porch is more than just a light. It's a symbol that our past does not have to define our future. My story has found its peaceful ending, but I know that for many, the battle is still ongoing. Please know this. You have the strength within you to build your own sanctuary and define your own honor. If this story resonated with you and you believe that healing is possible, help this message find those who still feel lost in the dark. Subscribe for more stories of resilience, and please, share this with someone who needs to hear that they are not alone. Thank you for listening. Hold steady.